Hi, and welcome to podcast 26 on developing screen ideas. The basic terms used all the time throughout actually refer to earlier podcasts, and in particular, the definitions of theme and story. So if you've not actually listened to those podcasts, it would be worth your while going back and listening to the basic 8 themes, including things like the fear of death and the pursuit of love, or dealing with the idea that story is about character motivation and not some great big plot device. And so therefore one is looking at only 10 stories in the whole history of narrative. And therefore, having taken a look back at those, or rather listened to them, you'll have a chance to understand how they're used when it comes to identifying and working the genre. We're still in the personal drama territory, but this time into a particularly distinctive group of narratives, the rites of passage. Now, I've deliberately put this after the domestic drama because these two genre groups are extraordinarily closely linked. When we deal with personal drama, we obviously have all those primary elements we talked about before. But in domestic drama, we picked out 6 or 7 key points that actually separate that from all the other genre groups. Whereas rites of passage essentially sits almost inside the domestic drama setting, but one or two serious differences. So, what do we have from the domestic drama that is still there in the rites of passage? Crucially, we have the fact that the secondary story has equal weight to the first, as in so many of these personal drama genre groups. We have the fact that secondary characters are really minor. They present additional problems to the main characters, and that's it. And that the locations are restricted, often taking place in very limited interiors or a very limited geographical space. As with domestic drama, ensembles are quite common. So, for instance, you can have things like Stand By Me. A group of boys go off to discover whether it's true or not that a body's been left at the side of the railway tracks somewhere upstate. Or it can be a single piece where a single character is going through a rite of passage, often to do with the nature of growing up, not necessarily in their teens. Some rites of passage, such as the old film On Golden Pond, deals with the rites of passage of moving towards old age. And those sorts of films have become quite good in recent years, from the comedies like Cocoon through to much darker pieces, such as Bad Lieutenant. Now, in these situations, we have a scenario where the rites of passage, though, does take a totally different approach to character and what you're seeking to achieve from the mainstream of domestic drama. The main story in the rites of passage often is to deal with teenagers. This is very much a set of narratives with the idea that the rites of passage is literally that, the passage from childhood to adulthood. And this is the second central point, that it is the challenge to the protagonist's way of life and what they're expecting out of it that forces them to realize that they need to move from where they are in their stage of life and the values and the attitudes and the experiences they've brought up to that point and undertake a major transition to a new point, which can be recognized as a new state of being in society. This is the crucial thing. We're looking here at not at validation as a simple goal, but validation as actually being expressed as the recognition that you've grown up or that you've moved from one stage of your life to the next. And this is a self-awareness, but it's also a recognition in others that this has happened to you, that you've changed. So, as with nearly all personal dramas, the arc of the central character is enormous, but in rites of passage, it's very much linked into a person dealing with growing up and moving from one stage of their life to another, and that being recognized by the people around them. Two classic examples of the modern era are Juno and The Boy in the Striped Pajamas, two radically different films, both in style and content. The first, Juno, as those most of you who have seen it will know, is about a young girl who gets pregnant, decides to keep the baby, but then give it a new home and not look after it. The boyfriend that she had, Paulie, is not clearly adequate to being a father, and she doesn't feel it's right in her time of life to suddenly become a young mother. But she does want to have the baby and pass it on. This brings into a whole series of tragic and funny and ultimately life-enhancing encounters, which allow her to move from being the young, inexperienced young girl who's just got pregnant to a young woman who's actually dealt with having a child and giving it up, and also understanding part of what it is to be an adult in dealing with a young couple who ultimately wanted to adopt the child and then couldn't cope with that scenario. This is a very strong, funny, interesting piece, and is clearly a rites of passage. Now compare this with The Boy in the Striped Pajamas. This is where Bruno, the son of a Second World War Nazi commandant, is actually, in the course of the film, becomes close to a young Jewish boy who's actually in a concentration camp the father's looking after. Over a period of time, that friendship grows, and Bruno starts to move from a naive, playful, isolated life with his parents into a world which is much darker and potentially more threatening. Ultimately, he gets to the point where the friendship with the boy Schimmel, who is stuck in the concentration camp, becomes so crucial to his own sense of self-worth that he decides to swap places with him one day. That leads to a fatal conclusion. Now here the rites of passage is not some funny, interesting little thing about growing up and moving on around sex and having kids, but it's very much about growing up in a sense of an awareness of coming out of your protected shell into a much more dangerous world and taking risks in that world that may ultimately have tragic consequences. In this sense, rites of passage can often be dismissed by many people as just a teen movie phenomenon, but clearly as a form, it actually has the ability to engage with young people dealing with quite extraordinary circumstances, or in some cases older people doing that, where people actually move outside of their world into a totally different way of being. In this case, where we're dealing with that, the audience needs to understand the nature of the world that you've grown up in, the value systems that had before any question of moving on happens. Too often in this plot, people rush, as they do in many personal dramas, to the point of change too quickly. The audience does not then grasp the rite of passage. You need to set up the sense of failure, the fact that the child or the girl or the adults have not actually achieved their rite of passage when they've desired it, prior to that journey which ultimately allows them to make it. This is a key plotting change, but is central to the rites of passage idea working. It is no good just saying, well, they're a teenager and they just need to grow up, so we'll just show the events of them growing up. No, we need to understand what the nature of that teenager's world is and why they can't grow up at that point. Face the challenge, fail at some level, and then go back in and face it again, and in this sense succeed at some level. Rites of passage may well be about huge arcs, but we need to understand that it's also a transition in life at the same time. And it's a transition which we'll always come back to and reflect upon in each culture and in each feature film narrative that's made in this form.